we're just going to pick and choose some concepts to talk about, because honestly, how do you talk about international law and hit on everything that you need to hit on? So there are a few things that I just want to sort of highlight in this chapter, and then we'll go ahead and take our break for today. So we know that we've spent this semester, and for those of you that go on to take business law too, we will talk about the U.S. legal system, right? That's our focus in business law. But there are legal systems that exist in every country, right? I mean, so it's easy enough to talk about our own legal system, but we also recognize that we are living more and more through technology, through just ease of getting from one place to another. We're just living in a very international world, right? We may never even step foot outside the United States, but do business with parties that are located outside the United States. And the question becomes, if there's a legal dispute, how are you going to apply the law where you have someone from a different country and they're not subject to U.S. law, right? So international law, to the extent, there's no such thing. There's no international constitution. There's no, countries have what is referred to as sovereignty, right? That they, each country has its own way of doing things, and no other country should be able to tell them how to do it, right? But the fact of the matter is that we are still intertwined. So, international law doesn't really exist. I can't bring up a book and say, we're going to, these are the laws that apply to everybody, because there are no laws that apply to everybody. But we have treaties, we have ways that we sort of work things around, and we give that the name international law. And it's a way to basically talk about how you sort of conduct yourselves with parties and countries that are, foreign to you. And also, more importantly, from a business law perspective, what about contracts and transactions between individuals and businesses that are citizens of different countries, right? So, yeah, we don't have a single legislative source. We don't have a single world court. We don't have a single executive branch that sort of is the international body, right? We have different treaties and different organizations, but they have their limitations. They're kind of limited in what they can and cannot do. But let's just do a little quick review. If you sort of think back to when we were talking about the Constitution in the very first chapter way back in September, right? We remember the Commerce Clause basically said that the legislative branch, Congress, has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, right? So treaties, we know, will require congressional approval. But it also involves this sort of system of checks and balances that we have within our own Constitution that stands, that the president, the executive, shall have the power to make treaties, but it has to be approved by Congress, not just all of Congress, but just the Senate. And we're going to say that it has to be 2/3 of the Senate. Right, so how many senators do we have in the U.S. Congress?
100.
Thank you. 2/3, right? Not a majority, but 2/3. So that would mean 66 senators have to say yes. And for those of you that talked about the Iran deal or agreement, we're careful to not call it a treaty, because it is not something that the senators, 66 of the senators, would have ever approved, right? So that's why the deal is a deal and not a treaty. So, a treaty, we'll talk about some examples of a treaty, require almost the executive, the legislative branches working together, more specifically the Senate. So yeah, agreement between two nations that is formally, and again, this is how we ratify a treaty here in the United States, but another country will have its own mechanism by which we don't get to tell them, your executive and your whatever their own governing agreements tell them to do is what makes that agreement valid in their country. And by the way, a treaty doesn't have to be one country and another country. It could be a multilateral treaty, meaning a bunch of different countries, right? For those of you that talked about, environmental law, know that there are talks going on in Paris right now. There were talks going on in Geneva. There were talks going on in Kyoto in years past. hoping for an environmental treaty, right? So we'll see whether we come up with something. Again, treaties are directed at something specific, usually trade and commerce, but now we're seeing potential for an environmental treaty. So, you know, you could have a treaty that's sponsored by an international organization. It could be a UN-sponsored treaty that some nations sign on to and so on. So again, it is something that the federal branch of our government has the authority to do, and presumably other countries have their own ways of saying, look, we know there's no international law, but we are going to agree to X, Y, or Z, right? And for that matter, we do have a legal document that governs. And you know, there's some nice slides here that basically talk about the United Nations, and I think I said in the study outline, but no, I'm not going to test you on what the legal structure of the UN is, or what the, you know. So we know that the United Nations is sort of a body to promote a way for countries to come together on different things, on human rights issues, on, you know, there's, for example, there's UNICEF, which is an agency for the Children's Fund, again, to usually in parts of the world that may be struck by natural disasters or famine or things like that, to give humanitarian assistance. Yeah, UNICEF is an example. But the UN itself was actually created by a multilateral treaty among a bunch of different countries when 1945. Think back to what had just happened. What had just happened?
World War II.
Thank you. World War II, right? And that was eye-opening in many ways. And, you know, and it's sort of, you know, I think after World War I, I'm sort of think back to my own history, League of Nations were formed. Again, it's a way for sort of the world to sort of come together and maybe be more prepared to deal with something that could, you know, before it goes to a war of that scale. And after World War II, you know, maybe nations decide, gee, could Germany, could Japan have been curtailed in their abuses if there was a coalition of countries that came together? So that really was the reasoning behind the United Nations. And again, promoting economic, social cooperation, protecting human rights, blah, blah, blah. I mean, their charter is pretty impressive. You know, it's today, 2015, you know, 70 years after the United Nations was formed, you know, we see the world, you know, in somewhat disarray, and we see the United Nations over time trying to do what they can. But again, you know, it takes the will of many, many nations, and there are strategic reasons, and there are political reasons, and all of those things that the United Nations, according to a lot of people, has been limited in its effectiveness. To say it bluntly, but does a lot of good as well, mostly on the humanitarian front. And again, we're not responsible for knowing all this, but I want just people to be aware that the United Nations, by the way, where are the headquarters?
New York.
New York City, right on the, you know, Midtown on the east side, and it's, you know, pretty impressive. You know, for those of you that go to the city every so often know when the United Nations is meeting, traffic is a nightmare because you've got diplomats from everywhere, avoid the east side, blah, 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 whatever. But yes, I mean, you know, that is the headquarters, something to be proud of, that we live across the river from, you know, a pretty interesting and powerful organization where world leaders are come and give important speeches in front of the General Assembly, and, you know, adopt important resolutions, and then there's security councils, and again, a lot of detail that if this was a course in international law, we would really be trying to understand a lot more of this. But here, we're just sort of, you know, introducing it, not the UN and its agencies are not on your exam, which is why I'm sort of going quickly. So yeah, they have UNICEF, they have the IMF. I mean, for those of you guys are accounting, finance students, know that the International Monetary Fund is sort of a body that kind of, you know, passes views on monetary issues and so on and so forth. So that's kind of interesting. Again, its legal authority is however much the countries that are, you know, members give it, right? So, you know, we have a hard enough time, think about it, running our own country with two big political parties that are almost always at odds. Imagine now bringing in a bunch of other countries and trying to reach consensus, right? I mean, we're talking about human beings, and obviously, you know, the United States is going to advance its interest, and other countries are going to advance their interest, right? You know, we see these days Russia as another big power saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, we have our national interest in Europe, and you know, and sort of everyone kind of just sort of because Russia is a big player at the United Nations, and so are the European countries. So you can imagine that national interests have a lot to do with how these policies go forward, and they make for very, for students of international law, make for very interesting kinds of issues that we continue to sort of evolve through. The World Bank and so on and so forth. So again, we're talking about, there's even an International Court of Justice within the United Nations referred to as the World Court. And again, we sometimes hear about human rights kinds of cases that are heard at The Hague. Even though United Nations headquarters are here in New York, The Hague is actually located in Europe, in the Netherlands. So, again, the history of the United Nations is fascinating, and it's just something that we're just getting a little preview of, but we certainly are not going into any detail. Okay, so that's like this huge body. But, over the years, we've seen that countries want to come together because of mostly economic reasons, where they say, hey, you know what? For example, the European Union or the EU. You look at Europe, and what it is it's the smallest continent with a bunch of very small countries that share borders, right? And then you come to North America, and you look at this huge continent, which is 3 countries, right? Canada, which is huge, United Nations, which is United States, which is huge, and Mexico, which is not just small itself, right? That's it. And so the European Union basically says, look, how do you compete with a superpower like the United States and North America in general, and then you have the Asian countries and so on. So basically, through much negotiation and through things that are still being played out today, countries basically decide sometimes to form regional coalitions. So the European Union is not every country in Europe, but it's most of the countries in Western Europe that basically have formed an international organization to, again, promote peace and security. That's a good goal these days, as we see, but also importantly, economic, social, cultural development, and it led to, for example, one currency. Like, remember, in Europe, there was the pound, there was the franc, there was the Deutschmark, there was other currencies, which, you could just sort of drive over the border or take a bicycle and be, from France to Italy or whatever, or take a train from London to Paris, and, high-speed train will get you there in 2.5 hours. Do you really now have to convert your pounds to francs? This is ridiculous. It's like driving from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. That's the distance we're talking about. So obviously, yes, countries will have their autonomy and their sovereignty, but it makes sense to kind of come together because, again, if you're one currency, if you sort of break apart these artificial borders, you're going to be more stronger, for example, economically to compete with the United States, which is 50 strong states, and so on and so forth. So the EU or the European Union is a very good example of that. Is it perfect? No. It's a work in progress, and issues come up. We've seen with sort of maybe not as economically viable countries over the years bringing down some of the more robust economies, and they're sort of having to deal with that, for lack of a better way of saying it. But yeah, there are challenges, but on the whole, I think people sort of agree that it makes sense to have regional associations. So again, I'm not going to expect you to know how the European Union works, but to be aware that it's a regional organization. NAFTA. Most of you are probably too young to remember 1993, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed. This was actually a treaty, which was very, very difficult to get through, even at that time. But it was a treaty that a then Democratic President, Clinton, worked out with a Congress that I forget in 1993 what the makeup was, whatever, but it must have been more Democratic, that because they got it passed with a 2/3 vote of the Senate. And the idea here was, remember, North America is obviously the 3 countries in North America. Again, it's an economic deal. Reduce tariffs, reduce duties, don't have these artificial quotas, get rid of the barriers that exist between, again, if you can cross Canada, you can cross Mexico pretty easily, right? And not, have sort of import sort of issues, again, to make us more competitive with, for example, the Asian countries where labor is cheaper and so on and so forth. Has NAFTA worked well? I mean, you could write your term papers on that. It's not been perfect. It's not been ideal. Some people are very critical of it, and others say, hey, it was a step in the right direction, right? So again, 22 years later, but the point here is that this is an example of an economic treaty that was passed as a treaty, not as a deal, not as an agreement, but as an actual treaty or a regional agreement. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but there are other regional countries coming together, Southeast Asian nations. Please don't memorize any of this. OPEC, by the way, is a type of a regional organization, right? The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, huge organization that still has a lot of influence and power because the world relies on petroleum, right? And it's not in abundant supply, but prices, artificially sort of controlling supply and demand, responding to natural disasters, things like that. So another example of an international organization, and on and on and on. I'm not going to go ahead and do, but you get the idea. Okay, now let's talk about disputes, misunderstandings, fights, legal issues that come up among countries, but more importantly also that come up among individuals that do business with companies and individuals located in other countries. So, every nation has what I would call sovereignty, meaning the right to govern its own affairs. They each have their own court systems. We have gotten to know the US court system, but other countries have a very different way of conducting, and I'm just talking about commercial disputes, business cases, and so on, right? So what do you do when you are doing business here in the United States with a country in Europe, with a country in Latin America, with a country in the Middle East, with a country in Asia, Australia? Doesn't matter where, right? They're not necessarily bound to US law. How are you going to resolve that dispute? Now, technically, the US District Court will hear cases, but how are you going to get jurisdiction? Is the company located in Dominican Republic willing to have the United States District Court decide their dispute? They might not. Otherwise, how are you going to get resolution on that issue? This is where I think the next slide is so very, very important. And one of the reasons I choose to cover international law, because for business law students, understand that planning is probably the best way to do it. So if you're going to choose to do business, and it's almost not even a choice. I mean, the world is one, right? We work across state lines, but more importantly, we work across national lines, right? So what a lot of companies and even individuals do is write into a contract what would happen if there was a dispute, okay? And these are referred to, anytime you hear the word clause, it's like a paragraph, it's like a term in a contract, what are referred to as choice of forum. Forum means a place. Or choice of law. Write down what will happen, not just write down, agree to what would happen if there is a dispute. If we're going to do business with another, you're going to provide me this, I'm going to pay you that. Well, what if you don't do what you say what you're going to do? What if you give me nonsense, garbage products, and what if I don't pay you? How are you going to recover? How am I going to recover against you? Well, a choice of forum clause will designate which nation's court has jurisdiction to hear a case arising out of that contract. Maybe you make the other party want to do business with me here in the United States, we're going to be subject to US jurisdiction, we're going to have our case decided by federal courts. Well, because remember, there's diversity of jurisdiction, right? You get citizens of different countries. That already gives the US District Court jurisdiction. Or, I would say even more importantly, what's not on the slide is, forget the courts, arbitrations. right, say choice of forum is a dispute decided by the rules of the Arbitration Association of Law. You know, it could be a more international organization instead of just a US-based organization. If the other party says, well, I don't want to sign on to, you know, this group that's in the United States, I want more of an international arbitration group. Okay, they're out there, right? And there are those, and remember, they're objective. They're, you know, they have sophistication in deciding these sorts of disputes. Very, very important to negotiate and agree to this. And you might say, well, hey, you know what? It's not enough to say where the dispute is going to be decided or how, arbitration versus courts, but what law is going to apply. Do we want US law to apply? Do we want the law of Great Britain to apply? Do we want, you know, Australian law to apply? Which law is going to apply? Because it's going to be different, right? You have to, and should not have to, but you should negotiate it because there's an economic cost to not having these clauses, and then ultimately, if you can't have a dispute be heard, one party is going to be out of money, right? So, and you don't know going into a contract who's going to breach it, right? You hope you never have to worry about this, but you're going to find not just international contracts, but even contracts that we have in this country with people that live, you know, which courts, which state's law. So why not have that negotiated into international contracts? I think this is really, really important. Understanding choice of law, understanding choice of forum. And the rest of this is pretty, but you know, the stuff that I've already been saying, active state doctrine, sovereignty, one country cannot question the validity legally of what another country is doing based on their legal system. And that's what led to this case that I'll do really quickly, was the Club Med case in 2006 that was heard in the 11th District in Florida, because the issue here was, you think back to Cuba in the 1950s, a lot of people fled, Castro, communism, so on and so forth. So, you know, these folks left potential, you know, property worth a lot back in Cuba. Those people passed away. Their nieces, nephews, family members are now suing to get that property back. But the Cuban government basically claimed that land, and now there's a Club Med on that land, right? So they're actually suing Club Med and saying that that's not your land, that's our land, you can trace it back to our family history, blah, blah, blah. And they're asking the US District Court to do something about it, and the court says, look, we are not going to be able to help you. There is something called the active state doctrine or sovereign immunity. We cannot, if Cuba says that they've done this under their national power to reclaim this land, that's their decision. We cannot say, well, no, I mean, it shouldn't this way, or, you know, there's eminent domain, you can't take someone's property. Those are our laws. You know, they have decided this case already. So, you know, sorry, nothing that the United States can do based on legal action that another country, in this case, Cuba, has done. And that really is probably all that I think is in this chapter that we are responsible for.